Drogon had not known true solitude in his early days, for he had always been tethered by something, by Daenerys' hand upon his flank, by the presence of Rhaegal and Viserion, who soared beside him, by the sense of destiny that pulsed in his mighty heart. But now, the world stood vast and empty beneath his immense black wings. He had left the armies, left the ashes of King's Landing, left even the memory of a broken queen. In that moment of heartbreak and fury, he had carried Daenerys' still form away from the madness of men. Some said he might have gone to mourn in silence. Others believed he had soared to the far ends of the earth to bring her body home to the ancient Targaryen seat. Yet no one truly knew the mind of a dragon, least of all a free one who had tasted both love and rage. He flew for days or weeks. Time was impossible to count in the air, for when Drogon rose into the sky, the mortal concerns of men drifted into insignificance below. He fed upon great elk in the mountainous regions, sometimes upon wild horses in the plains, and once upon a massive bull in a narrow gorge. Each kill reminded him of the raw truth of his existence. He was fire and blood incarnate, the last living terror that soared above the lesser beasts of the earth. The memory of his mother and the warmth of her hand against his scales were all that connected him to a gentler sense of purpose. Now that she was gone, that link of softness frayed daily. He began to fly on instincts older than any Targaryen conquest, older than the tongues men spoke when they remembered the doom of Valyria. He did not know, at first, why he turned his massive head south and east. Perhaps it was a subtle whisper in the wind, a call in the deepest recesses of his being. Perhaps it was the echo of an ancestral memory, for dragons had once come from that land. Valyria was a cursed place, men said. None who ventured there returned unchanged, if they returned at all. But men seldom understood dragons. Dragons listened to the hidden thrumming in the earth, to the deep fires that dwelt beneath molten stone. And so Drogon, black as a moonless midnight, soared high above the turquoise seas until their color shifted to a dull gray, soared across mountains whose peaks spat noxious fumes, soared toward a land that looked broken by cataclysm, by a wrath so old that men could only call it doom. His arrival in Valyria was heralded by swirling ash in the clouds, plumes of sulfur rising from fissures in the ground. The entire region seemed to hiss and groan like a wounded beast. Towers jutted crookedly from the ground, once proud spires of a civilization whose mastery of magic and steel had surpassed any in the known world. Now they were half-melted, walls of fused stone and glass that gleamed in the dim light of the dying sun. Rivers of black water reeked of acids and brimstone. The very air was suffused with a heavy heat that felt thick in the lungs, though Drogon's great chest rose and fell without difficulty. He was, after all, a creature born of fire. He felt no fear in this place. If anything, it felt like a homecoming. He landed upon a plateau of obsidian-like rock overlooking what must have once been a proud city square, ringed by ancient colonnades. The columns were shattered, some sunk halfway into the ground, others leaning at precarious angles. Broken statues lay scattered, chipped marble arms and heads that gazed sightlessly at the black sky. There was no sound but the low rumble of volcanic activity beneath the earth, occasionally punctuated by sharp cracks as some distant fissure belched steam. Drogon sniffed the air. It was heavy with the tang of old sorcery. He roared once, a thunderous echo that ricocheted across the ruins. He was proclaiming his arrival, whether to ghosts or to some unseen watchers. The wind rose, whipping across the black rocks, and for a moment, Drogon felt a tug. He could not name it. No man's words were in his mind, though he had once understood Daenerys' commands through a bond deeper than language. Now, he sensed a kind of pull, something that awakened a deeper memory. He stepped forward, talons scraping the ground. He spread his wings in threat, but there was no one to challenge him. He advanced until he came to the edge of a jagged hole in the earth. Hot breath rose from within, a vent that led into a subterranean labyrinth. He leapt into it without hesitation, using the power of his wings to control his descent, his large body slipping through the broken aperture that might have once been an elaborate tunnel. The darkness swallowed him, but his own heat, and the faint glow of molten streams far below lit a winding path. He perched on outcroppings of black rock, hopped from ledge to ledge, until he reached a broad cavern whose walls shimmered. Here, the air churned with ancient power. Here, something beckoned. Drogon lowered his head, leathery wings folding behind him as he cautiously crept across the cavern floor. Strange pillars of crystallized stone sprouted around him, their surfaces etched with glyphs that looked older than men. The temperature was sweltering, but it did not bother him. Steam hissed from cracks in the ground. Somewhere up ahead, a dull red glow pulsed, steady as a dragon's heartbeat. Drogon could hear his own heart pound in response, as if in communion with that silent thrumming. Nearing a half-collapsed archway, Drogon pushed past fallen debris, crushing smaller pieces beneath his claws, until the source of that pulsing light appeared before him. It rested upon a pedestal of black iron shaped like a monstrous claw. The object itself was about the size of a large melon, formed of some translucent crystal that seemed to hold swirling embers within. The embers brightened and dimmed in a slow, rhythmic pattern, like breathing. A wave of heat rolled off it, but it was not the mere heat of flame. Drogon sensed something else there, something that called to the oldest instincts in his blood. This was a relic from the age before the Doom, perhaps even older. Men might have called it many things in legends, but it was known in hushed rumors as Valyria's heart, an artifact of potent sorcery rumored to have shaped the dragon's connection to men, or vice versa. When Drogon opened his jaws and growled, the heart glowed brighter. He stepped forward, mesmerized, and sniffed the air around it. The smell was impossible to describe. It was like brimstone and old blood, like the musk of far-off storms. And for a moment, Drogon felt that presence reach out to him, a silent offering or perhaps a question. His tail lashed behind him, uncertain. Then he roared, spewing a torrent of flame that engulfed the entire archway, blackening the walls. Yet the artifact did not shatter. It gleamed with red-hot intensity, absorbing the fire. Something stirred in Drogon's mind, a flicker of memory, or perhaps a spectral voice. Dragons had been shaped in Valyria, or so men said. The Valyrians had harnessed their might, forging steel with dragon fire. Some believed the dragons were Valyria's mightiest creation, or had come from the 14 Flames themselves. Now, in this ruined realm, Drogon and this artifact stood as the last scions of that power. The swirling embers inside the crystal pulsed. Drogon roared again, a challenge or perhaps an acceptance. He flared his wings, and in a single motion he extended his neck and wrapped his jaws around Valyria's heart. Heat, so intense it might have melted steel, coursed into him. Drogon's eyes flared wide, pupils narrowing to slits as the relic's powers surged through his body. He was momentarily blinded by a scarlet brilliance. It was as if he had swallowed the living flame of the sun. His mind roiled with images he could not comprehend. Dragons in flight over a shining Valyria that had not yet fallen to doom. Sorcerers chanting incantations beneath a sky lit by 14 fiery mountains. Golden spires reflecting sunlight so bright it was blinding. He saw Targaryens of old, silver-haired and pale, forging alliances with the ancient blood mages. He heard the screams of thousands when the doom came, felt the earth shatter, the flames erupt, the flesh of dragons sundered by cataclysmic power. All this flooded Drogon's consciousness in the space of a heartbeat. He might have released the crystal, but something in him refused to let go. Instinct told him that he and this artifact were bound by destiny. Scalding liquid fire poured into his body, and Drogon's veins felt like molten channels of raw magic. A searing, ethereal pain threatened to tear him apart. His wings spasmed, claws scrabbling at the cavern floor. The relic's light pulsed faster, as though answering his heartbeat. Then, with a final roar that shook loose the pillars of stone around him, Drogon collapsed onto his side. The crystal fell from his mouth, rolling a few paces away, its glow dimming until it was merely a sullen ember. Darkness closed over Drogon's senses. He awoke to silence. How long he had lain there he could not know. Days, hours, it did not matter. He rose unsteadily, black scales rattling with pent-up energy. Something had changed within him. He shook his massive head and snorted, trying to understand the difference. Then he felt it, a slow, insistent thrum that resonated from deep in the earth, from beyond the collapsed archways and broken halls. It was as if he heard the heartbeat of other creatures like him, though faint and distant, hidden in pockets of the ruins. Drogon's eyes narrowed, a low hiss escaping his throat. There were dragons here, slumbering, or perhaps petrified or locked in some ancient stasis. The songs men told said that the doom had killed them all, but perhaps the truth was more complicated. Perhaps the sorcery of Valyria had forced them into a hidden sleep, a twisted reflection of the realm's demise. Still feeling the lingering energies coursing in his veins, Drogon advanced on the relic once more. It lay inert, only faintly pulsing. As he nosed it, he realized the power had transferred to him, or at least a part of it. The crystal was a catalyst, and it had chosen him, or he had chosen it. The last living scion of Daenerys Targaryen had become the vessel for this ancient magic. Without any further hesitation, he took the artifact once more in his jaws, though this time its heat did not burn him the same way. The synergy was complete. The hush in the cavern felt like the aftermath of some cosmic alignment. Drogon emerged from that subterranean hollow in a rush of beating wings. He carried the heart with him, clutched carefully in his foreclaws as he soared into the sky above Valyria. The swirling clouds parted around him, letting pale sunlight fall across the broken spires. The sense of other dragons echoed in his mind, calling from the corners of this once mighty land. He had come to awaken them. He knew it now, with an instinct that was at once primal and newfound. His roar tore through the silence, a harbinger of the return of a power that men had feared for centuries. He circled the ruins, scanning the ground below. Twisted lumps of melted stone dotted the once grand avenues. Some lumps, he realized with a shock, looked disturbingly like sleeping beasts turned to stone. They lay in awkward positions, half buried in the wreckage. Drogon felt the throbbing in his chest intensify when he looked upon those lumps. Were these the ancient dragons, trapped by the doomed sorcery? He descended upon the largest shape he could find, sending a storm of ash and dust swirling outward as he landed. The stone figure was immense, easily rivaling Drogon in size, though it looked warped and brittle. One wing was curled around its body, the other lay splayed and fused to the ground. Its head, if it had one, was angled away, hidden beneath a crust of black rock. With the artifact still in his grasp, Drogon closed his eyes and exhaled flame over the petrified shape. The white-hot fire bathed it, melting some of the brittle rock. He felt the heart in his claws pulse in tune with the flame, intensifying it. The flame shifted color from orange to a deep, shimmering gold. The shape cracked and hissed. Chunks of stone sloughed off, revealing battered scales beneath. A wing twitched. Drogon poured more flame upon it, roaring, commanding it to rise. When at last he ceased, a massive shape unfurled from the broken shell. Its wings, ragged with holes, beat feebly against the air. The creature raised its head and let out a rasping hiss that turned into a roar. Its eyes were milky at first, but then they cleared, revealing gold irises shot through with rivulets of red. It was indeed a dragon, ancient beyond measure, now awakened from centuries of entombed slumber. Its scales were a mottled green-black, flaking in places where stone had fused with flesh. But as it shook its body, new scales glistened underneath like newly forged metal. For a moment, it glared at Drogon, uncertain whether to fight or flee. Drogon spread his wings wide, showing his own formidable size, and roared. Something passed between them, an exchange of recognition. The newly awakened beast bowed its head. Though dragons seldom interact with each other peacefully unless bound by some kind of hierarchy or a mortal rider's commands, there was a new force at work here. Drogon felt the heart resonate between them, forging a link. The ancient dragon, perhaps once a mount for a Valyrian dragon lord, felt a tug of loyalty, or at least kinship. It flapped its wings and rose, shaky at first, then soared into the sky with a triumphant bellow. Drogon watched it circle overhead before turning his attention to the next petrified shape. He repeated the ritual of fire. Each time, the artifact magnified his flames, coaxing life from the stone shells that encased these slumbering dragons. Some emerged with horned crowns and ridged spines. Some were lean with elongated wings. Colors varied: dusky reds, deep purples, metallic silvers, pale bone white. Each resurrection felt like a piece of Valyria's lost soul being reclaimed. The city that had once resonated with the roars of dragons was beginning to echo again with that formidable sound. One by one, the ancient beasts rose into the skies, forging a swirling storm of wings above the land. Some were smaller than Drogon, others rivaled him in size, and a few dwarfed him by a head or more. Yet all seemed compelled by the same force that had guided him, the silent summons of the heart. As the dragons gathered, they circled overhead in a broad ring, their roars blending into a cacophonous chorus that rattled the crumbling spires. Ash swirled in the wake of their wing beats, forming dark clouds around them. Drogon, still clutching the heart, launched himself skyward to join their circle. In that swirling maelstrom of dragons, he soared to the center, letting out a roar that commanded attention. The older beasts hesitated. Some turned their massive heads toward him, jaws parted in challenge. Yet Drogon's flame, enhanced by the artifact, blazed in a brilliant arc across the sky, a molten sign that he was the chosen vessel of Valyria's might. Even the oldest recognized that in him was the living flame of their lost era. One by one, they dipped their heads in respect or submission. For a time, they simply flew, reveling in their renewed freedom. When at last the swarm of dragons descended back to the broken city, the ground shook beneath their landing. Their combined roars told tales of hunger, of a thirst for the open skies beyond this cursed realm. It was then that Drogon realized a deeper truth. The realm outside these broken lands had no knowledge of what stirred here. The men who survived in Westeros or Essos believed dragons nearly extinct, save for the rumors of Drogon's solitary presence. But now, an entire legion of ancient beasts lived again, their power bound in some measure to the Black Dread who had awakened them. In the days that followed, Drogon led them beyond the borders of Valyria. He had no rider, no queen perched upon his back, but the artifact he carried served as a kind of beacon. Dragons, for all their might, still responded to deep-seated instincts that resonated with magic. If once Valyrian sorcerers had commanded entire flightfuls of dragons with arcane rites, then perhaps Drogon, armed with Valyria's heart, had assumed that mantle. The renewed flight tore across the sea, leaving plumes of steam whenever they dived into the waters for food or soared near volcanic isles. They hunted whales, sharks, immense sea beasts. It was a spectacle no sailor had seen since the days of the Freehold. The sight of so many dragons crossing the skies filled men's hearts with dread and wonder. The news spread like wildfire along the coasts of Essos. Dragons, dozens of them, had returned from the dead lands of Valyria. The first city to feel their presence was New Guise, a staunch outpost on the island south of Slaver's Bay. Word reached the rulers there that black wings were seen in the distance. Then at dawn, the watchers on the city walls beheld a horrifying sight. More than a score of dragons swooped down, led by a gargantuan black beast with eyes that glowed like embers. The populace screamed, remembering the days when Daenerys Stormborn had come to break chains with but 3 dragons. Now there were many, and they looked terrible in their wrath. Buildings of clay and stone crumbled under the shock of their landings. The largest dragons simply perched on rooftops, snapping at each other. Smaller ones soared around the harbor, their roars echoing across the waves. Drogon descended at the outskirts, carrying the heart. Those who dared look from behind shuttered windows or from the cracks in the city gates saw him, huge and terrible, a living black shadow, whose chest rumbled with a deep, resonant growl. The relic in his claws flared with an eerie glow. Men did not know if they were being attacked or offered a strange omen. None dared open the gates, for there was no demand, no threat, spoken in words. Dragons spoke in roars and flame. They watched in trembling awe as the dragon pack lingered for a while, as if testing the air, then took flight once more. In Pentos, Volantis, and the other free cities, The whispers grew frenzied. Some believed it was a sign of the Targaryen restoration, that Daenerys' spirit guided these beasts from beyond the grave. Others said the ghosts of Valyria were on the march, that the ancient dragon lords had returned to reclaim the world. Merchant ships refused to sail in open waters for fear of being caught in the path of those monstrous flights. In every tavern, men talked of the black beast that led them, carrying a pulsing red gem in its claws. Then came stories of how certain lesser dragons strayed from the main group, terrorizing farmers and devouring entire herds of livestock. The old question returned: how does one slay a dragon? In the centuries since the Dance of Dragons, the memory of dragon killing had grown faint. Rulers began to stir. Princes, magisters, and triarchs convened to discuss how to protect their lands. The triarchs of Volantis sent out watchers to track the flight's movements. The Prince of Pentos closed his gates and forbade any talk of commerce with the dreaded beasts overhead. But as days turned into weeks, the dragons did not converge upon any city with outright destructive intent. They circled above, as if searching or waiting. They roosted in mountainous crags, on tall spires, or in ancient abandoned fortresses. They formed new lairs in places once known to have been dragon-friendly, as if guided by instincts from a prior age. Drogon himself visited the outskirts of Meereen, that city which Daenerys had once conquered. Perhaps some vestige of her was in his memory. He circled the Great Pyramid, but did not land. The people below lit fires on the walls, chanting the old name of Nyssa, perhaps in a plea for mercy. Yet Drogon merely roared and soared away. Those who witnessed it said it was as if the great black dragon were mourning something lost. As the awakened flight spread out across Essos, so too did rumors swirl in Westeros. Ravens carried the news to King's Landing, where the Iron Throne had a new occupant, Bran the Broken, according to some accounts, or perhaps another caretaker, if this was set in a timeline that diverged from that final hush of the war. Whatever the details, lords and ladies quaked at the idea of a returning dragon host. The Citadel in Old Town scrambled for ancient scrolls, detailing methods of subduing dragons. Every hushed library corner was searched for lost knowledge of the Valyrians. The name Drogon reappeared in urgent missives, for all believed he had been the last. Now he was no longer alone. Still, the dragons did not cross the narrow sea. It was as if an invisible line had been drawn. Perhaps the black beast remembered the cataclysm of King's Landing and the taste of ashes there. Or perhaps the newly awakened brood had some deeper quest in Essos, a calling that was not yet fulfilled. Indeed, Drogon felt an itch in his mind, a sense that Valyria's heart had not finished its work. The artifact thrummed in his claws whenever he approached one of the old Valyrian colonies or ruins. In some, more petrified dragons lay in wait, hidden under volcanic rock or collapsed temples. Each time, Drogon enacted the same ritual of flame, and more dragons joined the flight. It swelled from mere dozens to near 50. The skies began to look like the old days if old tales were to be believed. But not all these dragons were content to follow. Some, once awakened, seemed feral. They lashed out, fighting each other, challenging Drogon's rule. Fights broke out among them, with jaws snapping and tails lashing. In one such battle above the Valyrian mainland, a tremendous copper-scaled dragon clashed with Drogon in a frenzy of teeth and flame. The skies lit with arcs of dragonfire. They tore at each other's wings, black scales scraping copper ones. The heart pulsed wildly in Drogon's grasp, feeding him a surge of strength. In the end, he raked his talons across the copper dragon's throat, sending it spiraling into the ruins below. A mighty crash signaled its demise, and the others roared their acceptance. Drogon remained the undisputed alpha, if such a term could be used among dragons. Meanwhile, men did not remain idle. In Volantis, an ambitious triarch named Bellatrix Kobar sought to reclaim the ancient Valyrian might for himself. He believed that if he could harness the artifact Drogon carried, he might command the flight of dragons. He sent envoys with promises of wealth, magic, whatever the black beast might desire. Of course, dragons do not deal with words in the way men do. The envoys were swiftly devoured. The rumor that spread after was that one of them carried a hidden dagger laced with smuggled wyvern venom, but never even had a chance to use it. The Triarch then resorted to a different plan. He funded a group of renegade sorcerers, men rumored to practice blood magic in secret, giving them ships and men to venture into Valyria's outskirts and find some means of subduing or capturing a dragon. Under the cover of night, those sorcerers set up hidden snares, arcane traps woven from old spells and fresh sacrifices. They spilled blood upon ancient runes, thinking to anchor the slumbering magic that still lingered in that cursed land. And indeed, they managed to ensnare a smaller dragon, one newly awakened that had not yet learned caution. It flailed and roared as chains of shimmering purple flame bound its limbs, pinning it to the scorched earth. The sorcerers chanted, slicing their palms to feed the ritual with their own blood. Their purpose, so they claimed, was to break the creature's spirit and bend it to their will. But dragons are not so easily tamed. The moment their circle of chanting faltered, the trapped dragon seized upon the slight break in the magic. With a furious shriek, it tore free of the ethereal chains and set upon the sorcerers, devouring two before incinerating the rest. Only one escaped, crawling away with half his face seared by dragon flame, to bring the tale back to Volantis. Such failures taught men that the old ways of controlling dragons were not so simply resurrected. The Valyrians had spent generations perfecting their bonds with the beasts, forging sorcerous linkages that were lost in the doom. Now, that knowledge lay dormant or in fragments among the cryptic glyphs carved upon black walls in the labyrinthine depths of Valyria. Drogon alone had discovered the single greatest key, Valyria's heart, which did more than simply command the dragons. It awakened them from a magical stasis that had endured for centuries. That awakening also set them free, for all their fearsome independence and savage nature. Still, men hungered for ways to harness that power. In Korth, a group of warlocks conspired to lure a dragon with illusions of luscious prey. In Lys, a pirate lord offered a king's ransom in gemstones for a stolen dragon egg, not comprehending the difference between the newly awakened beasts and the eggs that spawned them. The mania for dragons spread across Essos. Whispers abounded that if one could gain a single scale from a living dragon, one could brew potions of immortality. Alchemists, mystics, and charlatans all scuttled forth, hoping to glean some profit from the new age of dragons. But these beasts were not docile. They did not gather in small groups to be hunted or bartered with. They flew in large numbers, devouring entire stretches of countryside, scorching farmland in their path. People fled or cowered behind thick walls. Crops burned, livestock was lost, trade routes became perilous. The Dothraki hordes, once a terror of the plains, now learned what it felt like to be prey. A Khalasar that stumbled upon a feeding pack of dragons found half its warriors turned to cinders. Khal Jarro, the warlord of that band, swore he had seen the Mother of Mountains weep flames that day. He retreated deeper into the grasslands, vowing never to cross the path of the winged devils again. All the while, Drogon led them, though not in the manner of a human commander. He soared at the head of the largest formation of dragons, the heart held close. Whenever they found more petrified husks in the old colonies, he repeated the ritual of awakening. If any challenged him, he fought them in a savage dance of fire. Always he prevailed, for the artifact flowed with the might of ancient Valyria, and Drogon was its conduit, shaped by Daenerys' legacy and the will of the Targaryens. It was as though the ghost of the old freehold had found in Drogon a new champion. As the flight approached the boundaries of the Dothraki Sea, the green plains stretching endlessly, they found a natural roost in a line of stony hills that jutted from the ground like broken teeth. There, a narrow pass led into a hidden valley, lush with wild game and a cool spring. Dragons fed, fought, and mated. They began to lay claim to territories. The nights echoed with roars and the crackling of brush fires started by stray gouts of flame. And still Drogon felt that something called him onward. There were greater things yet to be done. One dawn, a smaller green dragon brought down a wounded horse in the valley. As it devoured the horse's warm flesh, a figure emerged from behind a rocky outcropping. At first, the dragon hissed and readied to engulf the figure in flame, but something about this newcomer gave it pause. The figure was a woman of middle years, cloaked in strange patchwork garments. Her hair was shaved on one side, the other side braided in a manner reminiscent of certain Associ tribes. She raised a hand, murmuring something in an old tongue. The dragon hesitated, smoke curling from its nostrils. She did not bear the silver hair of Valyria, nor the pale skin of Targaryens, but her eyes gleamed with a peculiar intensity. In her other hand, she clutched a staff topped with a dragon bone carving. Slowly, she lifted the staff, and the dragon let out a low growl. Then, with a single swift movement, she drove the staff into the ground and whispered a word of power. The ground trembled slightly. The dragon roared. But before it could unleash its flame, a swirl of wind and dust whipped around the staff, forming a miniature cyclone that seemed to disorient the beast. Across the valley, others of the awakened flight noticed this disturbance. They roared and took wing, suspecting a threat. Drogon, perched on a stone ridge, also sensed the surge of sorcery. He launched himself toward it. The woman, seeing the approach of so many dragons, withdrew her staff and prepared to flee. But she glanced up and locked eyes with Drogon, who descended in a flurry of ash and dust. The heart in his claws pulsed with a dark red glow. The woman froze, perhaps transfixed by the artifact's power. The green dragon snarled at her, but did not attack immediately. When Drogon landed, he stretched his neck forward, sniffing the air around the intruder. She did not cower, though fear etched her face. Instead, she slowly lowered herself to her knees, placing her hands flat on the ground in a gesture that might have been respect or supplication. The black wings of Drogon cast a looming shadow over her, and the swirling dust settled. The entire flight bristled with tension. Then, something remarkable happened. The woman began to speak in a language long forgotten by most, one whose harsh syllables made even the dragons shift uneasily. She spoke to Drogon as though he could understand her words. Perhaps, in a sense, he could. The heart certainly could. She spoke of the old ways, of how her forebears had claimed to be distant descendants of Valyrian blood mages, who survived the doom by fleeing to hidden corners of the continent. She claimed that the artifact Drogon held had a name older than Valyria's heart. She called it the Ember of the 14, or the Eye of Fire. She said it was prophesied that a black dread would one day return to awaken the slumbering might of Valyria and reshape the world in flame. Drogon let out a rumbling growl, smoke billowing from his nostrils, but he did not strike. Something in her voice, or perhaps in the resonance of the artifact, stayed his wrath. She rose slowly to her feet, never turning her back, her expression full of a wild reverence. Then she knelt again and pressed her forehead to the ground. It was not worship in the sense men gave to gods, but something akin to homage to the power that Drogon represented. The other dragons, uncertain, beat their wings in agitation. In an act of daring, she extended a trembling hand toward the artifact. The moment her fingers hovered near it, the relic flared. Drogon hissed, baring his teeth, but did not move away. The woman's eyes rolled back in her head as if she were seized by a vision. She gasped, a harsh choking sound, and then reeled backward. Her staff clattered to the ground. When she came to, moments later, she stared at Drogon with eyes full of awe and terror. "They will follow you," she said in the common tongue, her accent thick and strange. "They must. The fires are not done. The doom was never undone. Only you can shape it now." Drogon let out a roar that echoed across the valley. The entire flight responded, a deafening symphony of dragons. The woman staggered, but held her ground. For days after, she followed the flight from a distance, sometimes perched on rocky outcroppings to observe. The dragons tolerated her presence, though warily. Perhaps they sensed that her knowledge of old lore might be of use. Dragons had no need of mortal words, yet the ancient sorceries that bound them to Valyria could prove crucial. At length, Drogon felt the pull of the artifact guiding him farther north, toward the old trade routes that cut across the Dothraki Sea. The flight of dragons followed in his wake. They soared for days over rolling grasslands, scattering herds of wild horses. At night, their roars carried across the horizon, accompanied by the flickering glow of dragonfire. Khals and their riders watched from afar, paralyzed by both dread and fascination. None dared challenge such a force. Eventually, they came upon an abandoned stronghold. It was a ruin, once built by some overambitious warlord seeking to carve out an empire on the plains. The walls were crumbled, the ramparts blackened by old fires. Within, they found more petrified dragon shapes. Drogon recognized them instantly, even before the artifact's pulse quickened. He roared at the sky. One by one, the flight landed around him. The woman, still lingering in the background, watched from a safe distance. Then Drogon unleashed the golden flame once more, resurrecting these slumbering beasts. Some emerged from stone shells, barely alive. One was missing a wing entirely, though it managed to roar and thrash feebly. Another was small, no larger than a warhorse, but with bright golden scales. Each new dragon joined the chorus of roars, adding to the unstoppable legion. But these awakenings took a toll on Drogon. Each time he channeled the artifact's power, he felt a searing within his chest, as though he were inhaling the raw essence of a volcano. The woman saw him falter one evening, stumbling upon landing. She approached, unafraid, her staff raised in caution. The black dragon's eyes glowed with a feverish light, and steam rose from his scales. She reached out and touched his flank with her palm, wincing at the intense heat. She murmured incantations, trying to siphon away some of the raw magic. Whether it helped or not, Drogon let her do so, though a lesser beast might have torn her limb from limb. The other dragons growled, tails lashing, but did not interfere. The days turned into weeks, and the flight pressed on. Each new ruin they encountered brought more slumbering dragons into the fold, though fewer now. The artifact's power was close to spent. Drogon sensed it weakening. He felt the final call, one last place to go, one last secret hidden in the recesses of the known world. The woman seemed to sense it too, her staff trembling whenever she gazed upon the dimming red glow of the crystal. "The shifting sands," she said hoarsely, referencing a region far to the east where the red deserts met the haunted shadows of the Bone Mountains. Legend spoke of lost Valyrian outposts there, far from the main seats of power. It was rumored that certain dragon lords had fled the doom, seeking refuge in remote corners, but none had ever returned. And so Drogon led the flight, a massive black storm of dragons flying across the desert, their silhouettes against the red sun an omen of unstoppable fury. They found a fortress half buried in dunes of crimson sand. Surreal shapes of twisted rock jutted from the desert, like the bones of a dead giant. In the courtyard of that fortress lay a cluster of petrified dragons, entwined as if they had huddled together in their final moments. Above them rose a broken tower, etched with Valyrian glyphs that had been scoured by sand and wind over centuries. The relic in Drogon's claws pulsed faintly, as though giving its last breath. The black dragon descended, wings buffeting the sand into choking clouds. The other dragons landed around him, forming a ring of watchful guardians. The woman arrived last, stumbling in the shifting dunes. She shielded her eyes from the swirling grit and approached cautiously. Drogon moved to the petrified dragons and roared, unleashing flame. But this time, it sputtered. The golden edge of the fire flickered out. He tried again, focusing the artifact's power, his entire body trembling with the strain. The woman cried out, her voice lost in the gale. On the third attempt, Drogon spewed a torrent of golden flame that cascaded over the petrified shapes, illuminating the courtyard. Sand melted into glass as the blast scorched the ground. The stone shells covering the dragons cracked and fell away, revealing half a dozen forms. But something was different this time. Instead of rising in triumphant roars, these dragons hardly moved. One managed to lift its head, letting out a weak hiss before collapsing. Another twitched feebly. The centuries had taken their toll. Perhaps their entombment here had been more merciless. Their bodies were too far gone to be fully revived. Drogon let out a low, mournful rumble that reverberated through the fortress walls. The artifact in his claws pulsed one last time, then faded to a dull black. Whatever fire it contained was expended. A sense of finality rippled through the flight. The woman, panting in the heat, staggered forward to lay a hand on the nearest of the newly awakened dragons, only to feel it die under her palm. The dragon's eyes glazed over, its chest heaving once, then going still. She turned to Drogon with a gaze full of sorrow. "They cannot be saved," she whispered. "Their time has passed." 2 others clung to life. The woman tried to conjure some ancient healing incantations, cutting her arm, letting her blood drip upon their flaking scales. One let out a feeble roar, flapping tattered wings. The other merely twitched. Drogon watched, silent. He felt exhaustion weigh upon his mighty frame, a weariness deeper than any flight could cause. The horde of dragons around them stirred uneasily, their roars subdued as if they sensed the futility. Then one of the barely living dragons, a slender creature with dull silver scales, caught sight of Drogon. Its eyes flickered with recognition, or perhaps just an instinct. In a burst of desperation, it tried to drag itself across the courtyard toward him. But its hind legs would not move. The sand beneath it turned dark with its spilled blood. Drogon lowered his head, sniffing at the wounded beast. A ragged sigh escaped its throat, and it collapsed. In that moment, Drogon realized that even the might of Valyria's heart could not bring back what was too far gone. Some echoes of the old world were meant to stay buried. He let out a roar, a long bellow that resonated with anguish and perhaps rage. The dunes trembled. The woman sank to her knees, tears mingling with the sand on her cheeks. The flight responded with a thunderous cacophony, a dirge for the lost. Fire blossomed from the throats of many dragons, lighting the evening sky with a hellish glow. In the fortress courtyard, the last 2 dying dragons breathed their final rattling breaths. In the aftermath, Drogon surveyed the broken fortress, the dunes, the dead dragons. He felt the lifeless artifact in his claws, the once pulsing crystal that had guided him all this way. It had brought so many dragons back from their petrified slumber, but now it was spent. He closed his jaws around it, crushing it to shards with an air of finality. Sparks flew as the crystal shattered, and a faint wisp of red light vanished into the air. For a long while, no one moved. The desert wind blew, scattering sand across the courtyard, covering the broken shells and lifeless bodies. Night fell, and the stars blazed above. In that hush, the woman raised her head. Her voice was shaky. "You have done all that could be done," she said, though she knew Drogon did not speak her tongue. Yet somehow, she felt he understood the sentiment. The days of old Valyria are truly gone. Drogon turned his massive head, regarding her with molten eyes. Then he roared softly. It was not a sound of anger or aggression, but something that hinted at acceptance, or even gratitude. The other dragons rumbled in unison, as if echoing their leader's sentiment. The woman bowed her head, tears cutting clean tracks through the grime on her face. She knew her own part in this saga was at an end. As dawn broke, Drogon launched into the sky once more, leading his flight west. They soared over the desert, casting great shadows across the dunes. The woman stood amid the crumbled fortress, watching until they disappeared into the horizon. Perhaps they would carve out a new age of dragons, rewriting the future instead of trying to resurrect a past that had turned to dust. She knew men would fear them, as men always did. But maybe, just maybe, something new could be born from the ashes of old Valyria's doom. The flight arrived in the grasslands and split into smaller factions, each group staking its claim to hunting grounds, lairs, vantage points. Men whispered that a new era had begun, one that might see dragons dominating the skies of Essos once again. Yet they did not come as conquerors for a single kingdom. They roamed free, unbound by mortal riders, forging their own savage hierarchies. If lords and city-states sought to oppose them, they faced fiery devastation. If they kept their distance and paid tribute in livestock or gold, though what use gold was to a dragon, no one could say, they might be spared. Drogon remained the mightiest among them. His presence was occasionally sighted above far-flung corners of the continent, from the basalt cliffs of the Basilisk Isles to the rocky heights near Norvos. Always alone, or at times accompanied by a handful of other large dragons who followed him with a sort of reverent distance. He had lost the crystal, the focusing lens of Valyria's old magic, but he had gained an undeniable mantle of command among his kind. No mortal could approach him safely. Archers on city walls who dared loose arrows often found themselves cremated in a swirl of black wings and fire. Legends began to spread again, reminiscent of the age of dragons. Maesters in Westeros wrote frantic new treatises on the return of the great worms, a study of post-doom draconic resurrection, the dilemma of the Valyrian heart. But these were mere attempts to understand what had occurred. The free dragons were not beholden to men's politics. They fought among themselves for territory, soared for weeks across open skies, nested in uncharted mountains. The phenomenon of their awakening might have changed the balance of power in Essos for generations to come. Some would be slain by enterprising dragon hunters. Others would grow old and monstrous, terrorizing entire regions. The world had once feared that the Targaryen dragons might dominate the Seven Kingdoms. Now men realized that those 3 dragons were but a fraction of what had been sleeping in the cursed ruins of Valyria. Perhaps, in time, a new rider would emerge, one with the blood of the dragon flowing in their veins, capable of forging a bond with these ancient beasts. But for now, their legacy was that of primal chaos and raw power. And at the center of it, Drogon's sword, black wings blotting out the sun, a living testament to Daenerys Targaryen's final legacy. He carried no queen on his back, but he bore the memory of her name in his fiery heart. Wherever he flew, men spoke in hushed tones of the unstoppable shadow that burned across the skies, waking nightmares long thought dead. In a remote corner of the Dothraki Sea, a young shepherd boy once caught sight of Drogon landing to drink from a river. The boy hid behind reeds, heart hammering in his chest. He had heard the stories of the black dragon who turned armies to ash, the resurrector of his kin, the harbinger of a new age of fire. As he watched, Drogon lowered his horned head to lap at the water. Steam rose from his jaws. The boy noticed the faint scars on the dragon's flank, the silvered lines where swords or spears must have struck once upon a time. He noticed how Drogon lifted his head, gazing across the plains as if searching for something beyond sight. For a fleeting moment, the boy felt a pang of sorrow for this mighty beast. Then Drogon let out a soft growl, spread his colossal wings, and launched himself skyward, leaving a gust of hot wind in his wake. The boy watched until the dragon was gone, a dwindling speck in the endless blue. And though his heart still pounded, he felt an inexplicable sense of awe. Here, at the edge of civilization, an ancient majesty had returned to the world, unrestrained by walls or crowns. Valyria's heart, that fabled relic, had done its work, resurrecting dragons whose time seemed lost. Now, they roamed free, neither wholly good nor evil, but powerful beyond mortal reckoning. The desert, the plains, the mountains, they were theirs once more. Over the years, the flight dispersed across Essos and beyond. Some followed migratory patterns, flying from the hot southern deserts to cooler northern mountains. Others established broods of hatchlings, for in their awakened frenzy, many had mated, laying eggs in hidden crags. The cycle of dragons was renewed in ways not seen since the height of the Targaryen dynasty. The knowledge of how to tame them, however, had died with Valyria. All that remained were scattered rumors of the old ways, incomplete incantations etched into black stone, and the ephemeral memory of a bright red gem that pulsed like a living ember. Still, from time to time, some whispered that Drogon himself retained the remnant of that magic within his mighty heart. The woman with the staff, if she lived, might have confirmed it. She had seen how the artifact's power intertwined with the black dragon's very being. Others claimed Drogon no longer needed the artifact, that he had become Valyria's heart in flesh, the beating core around which the rest of the dragons rallied. Whatever the truth, none could deny that his roar commanded an authority among them no other beast matched. Years later, caravans journeying through the Red Waste told tales of black wings passing overhead, followed by shimmering silver or copper or green cohorts. Small towns on the fringes of the Great Desert woke to find entire herds of goats missing, taken by midnight raids of hungry dragons. In the markets of Pentos, a hooded crone told wide-eyed children a story of how the Black Dread once locked eyes with her, and she saw in them the reflection of a fallen queen's sorrow. Whether it was truth or fancy, none could say, but the legends of Drogon stretched across every dusty road and sea lane. In the ruins of Valyria itself, new explorers occasionally ventured forth, lured by the idea of uncovered treasure or lost spells. Many never returned, their bones left to molder in the labyrinth of collapsed towers and molten fissures. Yet some claim to have glimpsed monstrous shapes in the gloom, slithering shadows that might be younger dragons hatched from eggs left behind by their awakened ancestors. A new generation of scaled horrors was growing in that cursed land, thriving amid the toxic mists and steaming vents. Indeed, the age of dragons was not so easily contained. Westeros, for its part, remained largely untouched by this draconic resurgence, separated by the narrow sea. But the day might come when a particularly bold or restless beast decided to cross those waters. Storm's End, the eerie, Winterfell. None were built with the notion that dozens of dragons might one day appear in their skies. Whispers of dread circulated among small folk and lords alike. Some petitioned kings landing to build up a new defense. The forges of Qohor in Essos rang with the forging of scorpion bolts, ballistae, and rumored new contraptions designed to take down dragons. Yet no matter how many weapons men forged, the same question remained. How many dragons could they possibly kill before the skies darkened with an entire legion? Thus the tension simmered across continents, an unspoken storm lurking beyond the horizon. But ironically, the dragons themselves were not seeking conquest. They followed ancient instincts: territory, feeding, mating, rearing their clutches. Drogon seemed to have shed any lingering purpose tied to human wars. The memory of Daenerys' final day might have taught him the futility of tangling too closely with mortal ambition. Or perhaps he simply had no rider to guide him toward conquest. The bond once shared between Targaryen and dragon had fractured with the passing of the last Dragon Queen. And yet, as the years passed, some travelers swore that Drogon would occasionally alight on a high pinnacle, gazing west over the sea, letting out a haunting roar at sunset. To them, it seemed as if he mourned a ghost he could never recover. Or perhaps he sensed that somewhere, in the direction of Westeros, the final chapter of his story remained unwritten. Men interpreted these signs in countless ways. A band of Sellswords believed Drogon was awaiting a new Targaryen to cross the sea and claim him. A red priestess in Volantis prophesied that the black dragon yearned to burn the seat of gods in Westeros. A wandering bard penned a tragic ballad called The Last Queen's Lament, imagining Drogon's heartbreak. The truth was as inscrutable as the mind of any dragon. Still, the world had forever changed the moment Drogon found Valyria's heart and awakened his kin from their unnatural sleep. Valyria's doom had been undone in a manner, but it was not a triumphant resurrection of an empire. Rather, it was a chaotic unleashing of primeval might. Perhaps the legacy of the Targaryens, the dream of a dragon-forged world, would take new shape in the decades to come. Or perhaps the flight of dragons would remain a wild, ungovernable force, an ongoing reminder that some powers cannot be subjugated or neatly constrained by the designs of men. Somewhere over the scorching plains of southern Essos, Drogon soared in the midday sun, black scales rippling with every beat of his gargantuan wings. Below him, a trio of newly awakened dragons followed, each with shimmering scales of red and gold. They roared, testing their voices against the heavens. Drogon answered with a thunderous bellow that shook the very clouds. High above, the sky stretched vast and merciless, an endless vault of possibility. He angled his wings and climbed higher, leaving the lesser dragons behind. The wind buffeted him, but he pressed on, climbing into thinner air where the sun's glare was blinding. There, in that solitary realm of cloud and light, he roared once more. The memory of a silver-haired queen flickered somewhere in his ancient mind, a presence that shaped him from birth, that had loved him and guided him until her untimely end. He might never see her again, never hear her voice, but in his roar echoed her spirit, carrying across the boundless sky. And so Drogon flew on, unchallenged, unstoppable, a black arrow fired across the horizon. He had awakened the slumbering dragons, fulfilled the secret call of Valyria's heart. Now the world trembled in the shadow of black wings and golden fire. Yet in Drogon's heart, a final piece of humanity lingered, a soft ember that once belonged to Daenerys Targaryen. That ember, perhaps, was what saved the world from a new tide of devastation. For if a dragon can love, it can also learn restraint. If a dragon can mourn, it carries within it the memory of what was lost. And so the fate of Essos, and perhaps beyond, remained perched on the fine edge of draconic will, a testament that sometimes the greatest powers in the world have no master, but carry forward on the uncertain winds of freedom and fire. In the months after Drogon's cry of mourning carried across the red desert and the heart of Valyria crumbled to shards in his jaws, the land continued to feel the tremors of the dragon's resurgence. Though the original artifact was gone, its influence still lingered in the world like the last notes of a haunting melody. Across Essos, travelers told tales of enormous reptilian shapes sweeping across the horizon. The flight, once united behind the black dread, had grown diffuse. Many dragons hunted and nested in scattered enclaves. Yet, they remained bound by some invisible tether to the one who had awakened them all. Drogon's presence loomed like a myth in the minds of men. He was seen at intervals, always powerful, always alone, except for a handful of loyal drakes who followed at a distance. Where he flew, the wind burned hot, and even the sun seemed to dim in deference. He no longer carried the pulsing crystal, but something of its essence had merged with him in that final act. Any city or fortress that glimpsed his wings in the sky felt a nameless dread, for they sensed he carried an ancient might in his blood and bones that words could not name. Among those who spun the new tapestry of legend was the mysterious woman who had joined him in the desert fortress, the one with the dragon-bone staff and the braided hair. The flight had left her behind, kneeling in the sands among the corpses of dragons too far gone to be saved. Yet she did not remain there. She took up her staff and trudged west, traveling on foot across the dunes until her lips cracked and her skin peeled under the harsh sun. Perhaps she was searching for something, answers or new ports of knowledge, or simply survival. When at last she reached a trading post along a parched caravan route, she was half-starved and delirious. The local inhabitants, hard-bitten men and women accustomed to the ravages of the desert, spared her a single glance and little else. It was only when she brandished her staff and muttered phrases in the old tongue of Valyria, scrawling glyphs in the dirt, that a few recognized she might be more than just a beggar. The tales she told were wild, that she had witnessed the reawakening of petrified dragons in the ruins of Valyria, that she had stood face to face with the Black Dread who carried within him the final spark of the ancient freehold's power. Most scoffed. A few believed. One old man, scarred across the face and missing an ear, claimed in hushed tones that his father had once been a dragon rider's thrall before the doom. But the arithmetic of years made no sense. How could the old man's father have lived that long ago? Indeed, the woman realized quickly that half the stories told in these corners of Essos were woven from lies, broken memories, or simple desperation. Still, a kernel of truth sometimes shone through. She exchanged the last of her meager possessions for a half-dead donkey and 2 skins of water, then followed the caravan route further west, hoping to find a place where knowledge survived. She spoke to travelers who had glimpsed monstrous shapes on the horizon. She learned that entire clans in the grasslands had been displaced by the dragon's roving hunts. She heard that walled cities like Norvos and Kuhor were fortifying themselves behind new lines of scorpions and trebuchets. In a tavern, she encountered a sloshed mercenary who claimed to have fought a dragon with a crossbow bolt dipped in wyvern venom. He swore it had wounded the beast, though it still escaped with roars of fury. She gleaned that not all dragons were unstoppable. Some could be harmed, though few enough men lived to boast of it. In time, she learned of a hidden library in the city of Mantares, itself perched on the edge of the haunted lands to the south. Mantares was known for grotesqueries and half-legendary monstrosities, so travelers tended to avoid it. The woman, though, believed she might find scraps of Valyrian lore preserved there. With no better path forward, she turned her donkey south. Her mind roiled with an idea that had taken hold of her ever since she witnessed Drogon shattering the heart. The power used to awaken the dragons had been raw and imprecise, fueled by the might of an ancient artifact. But if the artifact was gone, could there exist another conduit, a way to control or focus that same magic, to either quell the dragon's destructive impulses or harness them for a greater purpose? She had no illusions of forging a new empire, but she hoped for some means to prevent utter calamity. For each story of wonder, villagers amazed by draconic flight, there were 3 of terror. Villages reduced to cinders, farmland turned to blackened ash, caravans destroyed. Unbeknownst to her, others walked parallel paths. In Volantis, the Triarchs seethed with frustration at their failures to capture or control a dragon. The younger, more reckless Triarch, Narbalos Magor, was convinced that raw force could still succeed. He poured gold into the coffers of mercenary companies, forging a coalition of sellswords, ex-slavers, and red priests who shared only a single aim: to kill or subdue a dragon and bring proof of their victory back to the city. One might ask why did not simply fortify their walls and be done with it, but pride and avarice ran deep in Volantis. They believed that if they could wrest a single living dragon from Drogon's unstoppable flight, they might reacquire the dread Valyrian mystique that once made them the greatest city of the south. Meanwhile, in Korth, the warlocks who had survived Daenerys Targaryen's wrath many years ago whispered in their tall, slender towers of a night of the 1,000 flames. They performed rites by lamplight, inhaling fumes that turned their lips blue, seeking visions of the black dragon. Some glimpsed a shape of swirling red shadows in their glass candles, a vortex of power that momentarily manifested as the silhouette of a monstrous beast. Then the vision would fade to darkness. They took this as a sign that Drogon's fate was bound to Korth in ways they could not yet fathom. Perhaps in time they would send an expedition, but for now, they prophesied and waited. Over all these scattered plans soared the dragons themselves. Most humans rarely saw them except in glimpses. A silhouette against the sky, a roar echoing at dusk, a black shape descending on an unsuspecting herd of cattle. But in the shattered realms of old Valyria and its satellite colonies, entire flights had taken root. They were not a single coherent army. They were creatures governed by savage instincts, forming a tapestry of alliances and rivalries. The older, larger dragons claimed prime roosts in mountainous regions or ruins with geothermal heat. The younger, newly awakened ones prowled, seeking territories of their own. Battles broke out over feeding grounds, with roars and flame turning entire vistas into smoldering wastelands. But as soon as one dragon threatened a region inhabited by men, the cry went out, "They have come again!" And families fled before the storm. Far in the southwestern corner of Essos, beyond what was known as the Dothraki Sea, rose a range of jagged peaks where the temperature soared so high that the rocks themselves seemed to shimmer with heat. There, a cluster of dragons nested, among them some of the largest and fiercest awakened from petrified shells. One night, as multiple dragons slept in hollows or perched on ledges, a disturbance rippled through them. Snarls and hissed roars echoed against the stony cliffs. A single black shape glided through the darkness, massive wings blotting out the half-moonlight. Even in the gloom, they knew him. Drogon, returning from a distant flight. He circled once, letting out a low, rumbling call. Several dragons stirred, raising their heads to watch. None challenged him, though a few hissed in uneasy greeting. He did not linger near them. Instead, he landed on a high crag overlooking the entire range. He exhaled a puff of smoke, scanning the terrain with glowing orange eyes. His flanks still bore faint silver scars from old battles, but his size was greater than any other dragon visible in that range. A faint aura of intimidation clung to him, a relic of the deep magic that had once coursed through the heart. Over the next day, the other dragons hunted or flew about their routines, but Drogon remained perched upon that crag as if lost in a trance. Every now and then, he would tilt his head at the sky, letting the desert winds buffet him. He was listening to something beyond mortal ears. The echoes of dragons across the continent, the subtle vibrations of the land that once harbored Valyrian power. Though the crystal was destroyed, he still felt a resonance within himself, as if he were the living embodiment of that artifact's final gift. Sometimes, He caught flickers of presence from other enclaves of dragons. Faint tremors in his mind, not words, but primal signals of territory, hunger, aggression, or longing. Then he would half open his wings, let out a subdued roar, and settle again. Men would have called it brooding, perhaps. Dragons do not brood as humans do, but in Drogon's posture, there was an air of restlessness, a sense that he was still searching for something. Now that he had awakened so many of his kin, what next? He had no living queen, no mother figure to guide him, no rider perched upon his back. The fragment of sorcery that kept him tethered to the memory of Daenerys was faint as a dying star. So he sat, day after day, ignoring all who might approach, until at last hunger or curiosity drove him to take flight again. Not all the dragons in that region welcomed his presence. One evening, a massive female with scarlet and black scales took wing and approached the crag. She flew in slow, deliberate circles, letting out warning roars. She was a formidable beast, nearly as large as Drogon, though not quite. When she descended near his perch, sparks of flame crackled from her jaws. She sniffed the air, apparently deciding whether to challenge him. Drogon merely turned his head slowly, exhaling a stream of smoke. For a tense moment, they locked eyes. The female hissed, revealing fangs like swords. Drogon answered with a short, guttural roar, a sound that radiated authority. In the end, she backed away and flew off to a lower ridge, leaving him uncontested on the highest perch. But that did not mean the tension vanished. Over the coming days, roars echoed across the peaks as the two tested each other's boundaries. They circled in the skies, occasionally snapping at each other's tails, though never engaging in an all-out fight. In time, they settled into a precarious truce. She controlled the lower roosts and a portion of the hunting territory, while Drogon claimed the highest vantage and the best thermals. Had the artifact still been intact, perhaps her submission would have been total. But in this new era, the dragons' freedom was not so simply constrained. They were as wild as the storms that battered the peaks. Weeks turned to months. In the city-states of Essos, fear of dragons gave way to a grudging acceptance that the beasts were a new force of nature. Some cunning traders saw an opportunity. Supply the outlying settlements with weaponry or wards, glean profit from the demand for protection. Others sought novel methods of enticing dragons away, flaming sacrificial pyres of animals far from the city walls, so that a hungry beast might feed without incinerating the populace. In places where dragons laired nearby, communities adapted by building stone shelters with thick ceilings. Some left out entire flocks of sheep as tribute. And while dragons paid little heed to gold or jewels, they responded to an easy meal with primal interest. Inevitably, a few brazen opportunists tried to claim they could ride or tame these newly awakened dragons, pointing to the Targaryen tradition. Mostly, they ended up devoured or incinerated for their efforts. Yet rumors persisted of a handful of individuals who had discovered smaller, younger dragons and established tenuous bonds with them. No one had seen proof, but the mere possibility set many hearts aflame with longing. In the chaos of Essos, with warlords and slavers and city-states each vying for supremacy, the idea of controlling even a single dragon was power beyond measure. Across the Dothraki Sea, the grasses took on the burnished hue of summer. Khal Jarro, one of the mightiest war leaders, had spent months licking his wounds after his disastrous clash with a roving flight of dragons. Now mounted on a black stallion, he led his khalasar of thousands across the plains, their braided hair swaying in the wind. They had learned to keep watch on the skies. Whenever a shadow appeared overhead, they scattered, urging their horses into frantic gallops. Yet the dragons did not always target them. Some soared past, uninterested in these small, swift morsels, when herds of bigger game loomed elsewhere. Even so, every once in a while, a lone beast would dive, unleashing flame that roiled across the grasses in a fiery wave. The Dothraki responded with arrows, curses, and war cries, though rarely did an arrow find a vulnerable spot beneath draconic scales. This day, Khal Jarro rode at the head of his warriors, scanning the horizon. In the far distance, a shape hovered above a rocky tor, silhouetted against the midday sun. The shape was large, larger than any he had seen in weeks. Jarl reined his stallion to a halt, raising a hand to still his men. Could this be one of the monstrous ones that awakened from the deep south, or even Drogon himself? The prospect made his heart pound with a mixture of dread and excitement. If he could triumph over such a beast, the entire Dothraki sea would sing his name. But how could mortal riders with bows hope to bring down a creature of living flame? Then, to his relief, the shape moved away. The Khalasar rode on. Yet the presence of dragons hovered always in the corners of their eyes, shaping their every decision. Many riders yearned to find a safe route to the coast, seeking passage by ship to anywhere beyond these infernal skies. But the Dothraki were not seafarers, and Jarl clung to the old ways. He would not be driven from the sea by any scaled monster, or so he declared. It remained to be seen whether the dragons would care about his proclamations. In Mantares, that city infamous for its unnatural beasts, the woman with the staff pressed her way through narrow alleys that stank of rotting fish and sulfur. The architecture twisted in bizarre shapes. Some buildings had arches that soared too high. Others had windows shaped like screaming faces. Mantares had once been a lesser daughter of the Valyrian freehold, rumored to have dabbled in flesh crafting and other forbidden arts. Even centuries after the Doom, the city reeked of secrets. Upon arriving, she sought lodging in a rundown inn near the city's edge. Its proprietor was a squat figure missing half his teeth. He took one look at her staff of dragon bone and demanded triple the usual rate. She grudgingly paid. That night, she tossed in a narrow bed, half dreaming of roars in the distance. She saw Drogon in her mind's eye, perched on a throne of black glass, flames leaking from his jaws. She heard the echo of Daenerys Targaryen's voice. Though that queen had died years ago, her presence clung to the Black Dread's memory. In the morning, the woman rose and followed the innkeeper's directions to a hidden archive. It was buried within what had once been a Valyrian administrative complex, now overgrown with thick vines and nibbled at by gargoyles. A bribed guard let her pass. Inside, she found rows of dusty scrolls that no one had touched for decades, if not longer. The archivist, a pale, stoop-shouldered man, gave her a blank stare when she asked about dragon-binding sorceries. Then he smirked, revealing blackened gums, and directed her to the darkest corner of the library, behind a toppled statue of a sphinx-like creature. She spent hours sifting through ancient scripts, many in the old Valyrian glyphs she could only partly decipher. Most were administrative records, references to shipments of raw ores for forging steel, treaties with allied cities, genealogies of lesser Valyrian families. Only a handful contained references to lore of the second forging, or rituals for the unyielding flame. She traced the glyphs with shaking fingers, gleaning that these texts discussed the ways in which certain Valyrian families had fused blood magic with dragon training. The details were maddeningly incomplete, often referencing other volumes or specific ceremonies lost to the Doom. Still, she persisted, copying passages onto scraps of parchment with a piece of charcoal. In one fragment, she found mention of something called the Chain of Embers, described as a living conduit through which a strong mage could exert influence over multiple dragons without the necessity of a physical artifact. Her heart pounded at the revelation. If it were possible to replicate that phenomenon, might it calm the chaos that now consumed Essos? Or would it create a new tyranny of dragons? She recalled the Targaryens and their conquering ways. Yet, better a single controlling force than unbridled devastation. At least, so she told herself. But the text ended abruptly, referencing a temple in the southernmost part of the Valyrian peninsula, where the last of the Chain of Embers ceremonies had occurred just before the Doom. She found no further leads. Frustrated, she gathered her notes and left the library at dusk, weaving through Mantares' labyrinthine streets. She had half a mind to journey back south. Perhaps there were more secrets waiting in those molten ruins. But from all the stories she had heard, returning to the heart of Valyria now was akin to courting death. Dragons nested everywhere. The land itself was still cursed, and the memory of what she had seen there haunted her steps. Did she truly wish to see more petrified beasts, half-living, entombed for centuries in black rock? She shuddered. Her staff tapped against the cobblestones. She thought of Drogon. Her entire journey since their brief encounter had been fueled by the notion that the Black Dread carried a deeper meaning in his existence. He was no mere apex predator. He was a vessel of ancient magic, the last living link to Daenerys Targaryen's dream of breaking chains. A dream that had ended in ashes, but maybe still breathed in some hidden corner of the world. In her own way, she wanted to keep that dream alive, to shape the dragon's resurgence into something more than endless destruction. But how? A soft voice called her name. Her actual name. One she had not spoken in years. Startled, she turned. A cloaked figure stood in the flickering light of a guttering torch. He was tall and lean, with a face half concealed in shadow. She recognized him with a jolt. Eraz, a wanderer she had met years ago in the Red Waste, when she was only beginning to dabble in arcane studies. At the time, he had called himself a compiler of truths, though she suspected he was a smuggler of knowledge, trafficking in items of forbidden magic. "Strange to find you here," Eraz said, his voice as silky as ever. "You've come for secrets, I assume, or maybe something else." She felt her pulse quicken. Memories of their complicated past flickered. A shared foray into a haunted temple. An ill-advised attempt to conjure illusions with shadowbinders from Ashai. A fleeting alliance that ended when Eraz vanished with half the spoils. She steadied herself. "Perhaps I am. Why are you here?" He laughed softly. "Mantares is a good place to hide, especially with dragons prowling the skies. The monstrous and the unnatural have always thrived here, have they not?" He moved closer, letting the torchlight illuminate his features. Fine scars crisscrossed his left cheek, souvenirs from some misadventure. "I hear whispers that you were with the Black Dread himself, that you witnessed him awaken the petrified." She turned away, uncertain why her heart fluttered at the memory. "I was present at one of the awakenings, yes." "And you survived," he said, sounding half amazed. "Not many can claim that. So it must be true. You have some small affinity for their power, or at least for the old sorcery that binds them." She tapped her staff on the ground. "What if I do?" His eyes flicked to the dragon bone. "I might have information that could help you. Or perhaps you have information that might help me." She regarded him warily. "Why would you help me?" His smile was wry. "Because times are changing, and in a world full of dragons, knowledge is the last real currency. You and I both have sought knowledge that edges the boundaries of what is permitted. We can cooperate, or we can part ways, and both be poorer for it." She thought of refusing him outright, but her exhaustion weighed too heavily. She had found only fragments of the old lore in the library. If Eraz had more pieces of the puzzle, she could not afford to spurn him. So she nodded tersely. "Fine, but not here." They found a secluded courtyard overgrown with pale mushrooms that glowed faintly in the moonlight. Eraz retrieved a small scroll from under his cloak, handing it to her. She unfurled it, squinting at the cramped glyphs. It described in incomplete detail a practice called the gifting of the ember, in which a living dragon's blood might serve as a focus to reforge a psychic bond. The text had marginal notes in another hand, referencing an unnamed black behemoth, believed to carry within it the residue of the old artifact. She glanced up, brow furrowed. "Where did you get this?" He shrugged. "From a merchant in Volantis who dealt in stolen scrolls. I traded a prized relic for it. There's more, though it's scattered across multiple documents. Some in Qohor, others in Lys, possibly more in Ashai. The gist is that the Valyrian blood mages once believed they could replicate the function of certain artifacts by using the living essence of a powerful dragon. They called it the living key. The problem is that you need a dragon of extraordinary potency, like Balerion the Black Dread once was, or perhaps Drogon. Nabarisian. She felt her throat tighten. Drogon was indeed of a lineage that traced back to Balerion. Daenerys' largest had grown to monstrous proportions. If these old texts were correct, his blood might serve as a key to forging a new link between humans and dragons. A horrifying prospect if it fell into the wrong hands. But in the right ones, could it save countless lives from unbridled devastation? Or risk unleashing a second doom? She exhaled slowly. So the old sorcery was not fully lost. It just requires the right vessel. Eraz nodded. I gather that's what they were trying to do with the relic you call Valyria's heart. The artifact was a catalyst, but it could be recreated in a sense, or replaced, if you had living essence from an apex dragon. Of course, you'd also need to know the specific rituals, and those might be even harder to find. The scroll references the forlorn temple of Aduruses as a site where the rites were performed. That temple supposedly sank beneath the sea after the doom, though some say it's partially intact along the southwestern coast. She stared at the text. The southwestern coast of Essos was a labyrinth of drowned cities and shattered peninsulas. Locals told stories of waters haunted by ghosts of the doom. But if a part of that temple remained, it might hold the final puzzle piece. She glanced up at Eraz. How do you plan to use this knowledge? He lifted his hands, palms out, as if to show innocence. I'm no warrior, and I'm certainly no match for a dragon. But knowledge is valuable, especially in these times. If we could find the temple, retrieve the rites, and perhaps locate Drogon. He trailed off, letting the implication speak for itself. They might attempt the forging of a new bond. We'd either become the most powerful figures in Essos, or die in a blaze of dragonfire. She closed the scroll. A wave of conflicting emotions washed over her. The memory of standing face to face with Drogon. The awe, the terror, the sense that she had glimpsed something beyond mortal ken. Was she truly ready to try to bind him? In her mind flashed the vision of a free sky teeming with dragons who needed no human chain. Then she recalled the charred remnants of villages she had passed on her journey. The destruction wrought by savage flight, the bones of men and livestock fused in the burned earth. An image came of the two dragons in that fortress courtyard, who died even after awakening, as if the stasis had ruined them beyond salvage. She felt a pang of sorrow. Could she stand by and watch the continent descend into chaos, or let innocent lives be devoured because no one could control the dragons? She lifted her gaze to Eraz. I'll go with you to the southwestern coast, if that's where these temple ruins might be found. But mark me, Eraz, if this knowledge is used to subjugate or enslave the dragons for personal gain, I'll do everything in my power to stop you. A soft laugh escaped him. You haven't changed much. Always the moral compass. Then he shrugged. Very well. In truth, I'm not foolish enough to think we can turn dragons into docile beasts. But perhaps forging a bond with Drogon, or at least negotiating some kind of accord, would give us a measure of influence. Enough to prevent catastrophe, or enough to defend ourselves from the Triarchs, who will certainly come knocking once they catch wind of any success. Men. She frowned. They're not the only ones. The Carthene warlocks, the Red Priests in Volantis, the sellsword armies, many will want a piece of this. Yes, Eraz said. And that's exactly why we must be quick and discreet. So they sealed their uneasy alliance. Over the next few days, they purchased supplies, bartered for passage on a river barge, and prepared to leave Mantares under false pretenses. The woman sold her donkey and replaced it with a sturdier horse. Eraz claimed to know a route that avoided the worst of the cursed lands, though even he admitted it was not guaranteed safe from dragons. She spent her nights in the cramped inn poring over the stolen scroll. The glyph spoke of needing the living spark from the apex beast's blood, likely a scale or droplet of blood forcibly taken. She wondered if Drogon would let them take such a sample willingly. Probably not. And the text implied that the spark must be quickened by mortal blood as well, a shared offering to fuse the bond. She shivered, remembering the high price of blood magic in the stories told of Miri Maz-Dur and the sacrifices Daenerys had made. Was she truly prepared to walk that path? In the end, she reasoned that knowledge itself was not evil. It was the manner of its use that could save or damn. If forging a link with Drogon could help protect both dragons and men from endless warfare, it might be a worthy risk. Yet she resolved to keep her own soul intact, refusing any monstrous sacrifices. If that meant the ritual failed, so be it. She wrapped the scroll in oilcloth and packed it carefully in her saddlebag. They departed Mantares at dawn, slipping out a side gate to avoid the main thoroughfare. The air was heavy with sulfur and a clinging haze that stung the eyes. Her horse snorted, restless. Eraz rode a lean brown mare that he guided with a calm hand. They had a small pack-horse for provisions. The city soon disappeared behind them, swallowed by the jagged silhouettes of distant spires. For a week, they traveled through parched plains dotted with volcanic vents that belched noxious fumes. The ground in places was black and cracked, reminiscent of the edges of Valyria. Occasionally they saw winged shapes overhead, but at such a great height that it was impossible to tell if they were dragons or large carrion birds. By night, they heard faint roars echoing off the hills. Once, near dusk, they spotted a smoldering ruin, perhaps a large wagon train or caravan that had been roasted to cinders. Scorched skeletons littered the ground. Eraz insisted on searching for any salvageable items, but found only melted lumps of metal and fused glass. The woman suppressed a wave of nausea and rode on. As they approached the southwestern coast, the land gave way to rolling hills of reddish stone. Salt breezes blew in from the summer sea. The horizon was tinted purple and gold at sunset, a surreal beauty that contrasted sharply with the knowledge that dragons might appear at any moment. After days of lonely travel, they came upon a coastal settlement clinging to a rocky promontory. It consisted of a handful of stone huts, a small harbor with rickety docks, and a watchtower manned by a single board guard. The settlement had no official name that they could discern, but the locals called it Shaliaspoint. They stabled their horses at a makeshift inn where the floor was strewn with pungent seaweed. The innkeep, a wiry old woman missing 3 fingers, asked them no questions as long as they had coin. Eraz inquired discreetly about any local knowledge of sunken temples along the coast. The mention of such places made the innkeep's face pale, and she muttered about curses. Nevertheless, a few cups of cheap spiced wine loosened her tongue. She admitted that fishermen sometimes told tales of seeing weird shapes under the water, partial ruins, pillars carved with strange symbols. Over the years, a few brave souls had dived to investigate. Some never returned. Those who did spoke of labyrinthine halls filled with darkness and drifting seaweed, scuttling creatures, and a sense of dreadful presence. The woman felt a flicker of excitement. This aligned with the text that suggested part of the temple might be submerged. She pushed further, asking if any local had returned with an artifact or any object that could confirm the temple's identity. The innkeep shook her head. They talk about it, but no one's brave enough or foolish enough to go deep. The water is cold, full of currents, and who knows what else lurks in those ruins. Ghosts of Valyria, they say. That evening, Eraz and the woman conferred in hushed tones, leaning over a table scratched with old graffiti. If we have to dive for the temple, we'll need equipment. Ropes, maybe some netting or a boat, Eraz said. Not to mention a means of breathing underwater, unless we trust we can do it quickly. The woman nodded. I can attempt a small water-breathing enchantment, but I've never done it on a large scale. And if the labyrinth is extensive, he sighed, we'll have to adapt. We might try to find a local diver, pay them generously. But if it's truly a partial submergence, some corridors might be above water. The temple might exist half in and half out of the sea, depending on how the land shifted after the doom. There could be collapsed sections, hidden air pockets. It's a gamble. They resolved to investigate the shore at first light, searching for any sign of ruins. The next morning, they hired a fisherman named Ormo to ferry them along the coastline in his rickety sailboat. He eyed them with suspicion but agreed for triple his usual rate. Under a gray sky, they set sail, hugging the craggy coast where the sea foamed against jagged rocks. The woman stood at the bow, scanning the cliffs. After an hour, she spotted something. A partially submerged archway, carved with the faint outlines of serpentine dragons. Time and tide had worn it, but the shapes were unmistakable. She called to Ormo, who steered closer. As they approached, the water took on a sickly green hue. Seaweed clung to the archway's base. Beyond, they glimpsed the mouth of a tunnel, large enough for a small craft to enter if the tide was favorable. Eraz studied the rocks. This must be part of the temple complex. The entrance is half sunk. The tide's low right now, so we might be able to navigate inside, but we must be wary. The currents could trap us if they rise unexpectedly. Ormo balked at the idea of sailing into such a cursed place. It took a heavy payment to persuade him to linger near the arch, while Eraz and the woman took a smaller skiff, no more than a rowboat, into the tunnel. The fisherman refused to enter himself, claiming he'd wait outside. If they didn't return by the time the tide shifted, he would sail back without them. They accepted his terms. After all, they had no leverage but gold. In the narrow skiff, Eraz sat at the oars while the woman used her staff to push away floating debris. Darkness enveloped them as they passed under the arch. A dank odor rose from the water, and strange echoes rebounded off the tunnel walls. The woman invoked a small orb of witchlight, which drifted above her hand, casting a pale glow. It revealed walls lined with collapsed carvings, glimpses of more serpentine dragons, etched in a style reminiscent of old Valyria. Water dripped from above. The woman felt her pulse quicken. This was no mere legend. Here was tangible evidence of that lost empire's presence. If the chain of embers, or gifting of the ember rites, were recorded anywhere, it could be here. They rowed deeper, passing through a wide chamber that might once have been a ceremonial hall. Half of it was submerged, so the boat glided over broken columns. The orb of light illuminated jagged shapes beneath the surface. Remnants of statues, scattered bones of fish or larger creatures. The woman felt an unsettling quiet, as if something watched from the murky depths. Eraz maintained a stoic front, but she could see tension in his jaw. Eventually, they reached a stone platform, rising a few inches above the water. A possible landing spot. Eraz carefully guided the skiff alongside it, and the woman tied it off. They clambered onto slick stones. Overhead, part of the roof had collapsed, letting in a sliver of daylight that revealed another corridor leading deeper into the temple. It sloped upward, which meant it might be dry beyond. They moved forward, boots scraping across algae and barnacles. Beyond the corridor lay a partially intact chamber. Its walls were lined with reliefs depicting robed figures bowing before enormous dragons. At the center, a stone dais rose, ringed by carved pillars that might once have supported a high dome. Half the dome had caved in, leaving rubble strewn across the floor. The gloom lent the place an eerie atmosphere, as if the ghosts of Valyrian priests still haunted these halls. The woman raised her witchlight orb, scanning for inscriptions. Eraz knelt to examine a broken pillar. It bore a swirling pattern of glyphs that matched those in his stolen scroll. He muttered, "This is definitely the same tradition. Look here. This symbol is repeated, the spiral with the dragon's head. It signifies the forging of a bond." She hurried to his side, eyes gleaming. Could there be a record of the actual ritual? They searched the chamber meticulously, moving chunks of debris to reveal hidden carvings. Time had eroded much, but on one panel near the dais, they discovered a series of glyphs that told a partial story. References to the Ember Chain Rite, a depiction of robed figures cutting their palms, offering blood to a dragon towering above them. The final scene showed the robed figures with arms raised, as if commanding multiple smaller dragons around them. Eraz's voice trembled with excitement. "This is it, proof that such rites were performed here. The question is there a more complete record, perhaps some stone tablet or hidden crypt where the instructions are preserved in detail?" They pressed on, following a side passage that led into deeper corridors. Some sections were flooded, forcing them to wade through knee-deep water. Twice they had to turn back from collapsed tunnels. After nearly an hour of slow, careful exploration, they discovered a small annex. A domed chamber that survived mostly intact, though cracks ran through its ceiling. In the center stood a stone pedestal, and upon it lay a thick tablet etched with rows of glyphs. Despite centuries of erosion, the inscriptions were still legible. The woman approached with reverence, gingerly wiping away a layer of silt. Her heart pounded as she recognized many of the glyphs from her notes in Eraz's scroll. This was likely a primary record of the Emberchain Rite, if not the entire text, at least a substantial portion. Eraz hovered at her side, eyes gleaming. Carefully, they used the witchlight to read the glyphs, line by line. It spoke of how the rite demanded the blood of the apex dragon, drawn in ritual combat or seized by cunning, mingled with the blood of the officiant. The officiant would then perform incantations in High Valyrian, binding themselves to the dragon's living spark. If successful, they would achieve a measure of communion, able to calm or direct the dragon's actions, though only if the beast's will did not wholly reject them. In cases where the dragon's will was stronger, the officiant risked madness or death. The text hinted that a truly powerful dragon, one chosen by the gods of Valyria, could link not just to the officiant, but to an entire flight, forging a chain of mental resonance across multiple dragons. This could grant near absolute dominion or become an unthinkable cataclysm, should the officiant's intentions be malevolent. The ritual required a specific chant, repeated thrice under conditions of potent fire. The forging flame, as the glyphs described it. Eraz murmured. So that's how the Valyrian dragonlords controlled entire legions of beasts. Not merely by raising them from hatchlings, but by harnessing this ancient rite. Dragons imprint on those who raise them, but for controlling an existing adult population, they needed something more potent. Like we suspected, this is old blood magic. The woman nodded, her face pale. She could almost sense the aura of dread emanating from the tablet. There was a final line describing the necessity of a living heart to seal the vow, though it was ambiguous whether that meant the heart of a dragon or a human. Translations were tricky, but it seemed to imply a mortal might have to offer up part of their own life essence, or that of a sacrificial victim. The text was vague. She touched the carved glyph gently. This ritual is dangerous, perhaps too dangerous. Eraz gave her a sharp look. All magic is dangerous, but this could prevent the endless cycle of devastation. Think of it. If we can form a bond with Drogon, persuade him that we mean no harm, we might direct the flight to safer hunting grounds, maybe even broker some arrangement with the free cities. At least we'd avoid an all-out war between men and dragons. Right now, that war is already creeping across Essos. She bit her lip, recalling charred bodies in the desert. But if the price is blood sacrifice, how do we reconcile that with our conscience? His expression hardened. Men are dying by the hundreds already. If shedding some blood in a controlled ritual spares thousands more, is it not worth it? We have to be pragmatic. She wanted to argue, but the truth stung. She could not dismiss his logic. Still, the notion of performing any sacrificial rite made her feel ill. But what if the sacrifice could be minimal? The text was ambiguous. Perhaps just a small portion of blood, not necessarily a life. She clung to that hope. Let's copy this down carefully. We can decide how to interpret it afterward. They spent the next hour painstakingly transcribing the glyphs onto fresh parchment. The woman recited certain lines aloud in Valyrian, haltingly, to ensure they captured the correct vowels and emphases. The chamber reverberated with the ancient language, as if the ghosts of the old priests were listening. Once finished, they stowed the parchment in oilcloth and prepared to depart. On their way back, as they retraced their steps to the skiff, a subtle tremor shook the temple. Loose stones clattered from above, and the water in the chamber rippled. Eraz tensed. Did you feel that? Another tremor followed, stronger. A chunk of the ceiling crashed into the water, sending up a spray. They broke into a run, sloshing through the corridors. Perhaps the temple, long precarious, was on the verge of collapsing further. They reached the boat to find the water level rising, surging in from the corridor that led outside. The tide. If they didn't hurry, the route might flood entirely, trapping them in these chambers. They clambered aboard, Eraz fumbling with the ropes. He rowed with desperate speed. The woman used her staff to push aside bits of floating debris. Another tremor rumbled. The corridor's stone walls groaned as if they might buckle. Water splashed in wild eddies. At last they saw daylight at the far end of the tunnel. The archway loomed, but between them and escape, a chunk of collapsed rubble narrowed the passage. Eraz gritted his teeth and rowed harder. The skiff scraped against the stone. The woman held her breath. Somehow they squeezed through. A final wave broke against the skiff, nearly capsizing them, but Eraz stabilized it. Then they burst out into open air, where Ormo's fishing boat waited. The fisherman's face was etched with anxiety. "God save us, you're alive," he muttered, helping them aboard. "The tide's coming in fast. We need to get away from these rocks." In minutes, they hoisted the skiff aboard, raised the small sail, and navigated back around the jagged coastline. The woman watched the archway recede behind them. Another tremor shook the cliffs, sending a cascade of rubble into the sea. She wondered how much of the temple had survived that collapse. They had at least rescued the crucial inscription. Perhaps that was all that mattered. When they returned to Chalias Point, Ormo demanded extra coin, claiming the journey was far more dangerous than he'd agreed upon. Eraz grudgingly paid. They took their parchment to the inn and spent the rest of the day drying it out, cross-referencing the lines with Eraz's stolen scroll. By nightfall, they had pieced together a rough outline of the ritual. The woman's heart pounded as she read it in full context. The rite was more specific than she'd first assumed. It called for a gathering of flames around the officiant, likely meaning they had to stand in dragonfire, or at least near it, while speaking the incantation. The dragon's blood, newly spilled, had to be mingled with the officiant's own blood, and the entire ceremony had to be completed under an open sky. A final phrase alluded to the Watchers in Shadow, which neither of them fully understood, possibly referencing old Valyrian gods or cosmic forces. Eraz drummed his fingers on the table. "Logistically, how do we do this? We have to confront Drogon, draw his blood, probably a scale or a cut that yields enough blood. Then we need him to unleash his flame around us without simply killing us. And we must chant the incantation perfectly in High Valyrian." She envisioned standing before the Black Dread, arms raised as he belched fire, hoping he did not simply incinerate her. Her stomach churned. "We need a plan to ensure he doesn't see us as a threat, or if he does, that he doesn't kill us outright. I once stood close to Drogon. Daenerys had taught him not to harm certain people. But that was years ago, and he never truly obeyed me. Now, free of any rider, he's even more unpredictable." "Sad." Eraz's gaze flicked to her staff. "You have some measure of magic that calmed a smaller dragon once, did you not? In the desert fortress you told me about." She recalled how she had used a wind incantation, disorienting a green dragon for a moment. That was different, and it barely worked. "But perhaps I can attempt something else, like a warding circle to keep him from devouring us while we initiate contact." She paused, chewing her lip. "We also need to know where Drogon is. He moves unpredictably across Essos from what I've heard. Finding him could take months." Eraz smirked. "Perhaps not. Word on the tongues of travelers. They say a monstrous black dragon was spotted not far from Volantis, then again near the Isle of Cedars. It's possible he's circling the southern coast. Some hypothesize he's drawn by the volcanic activity in that region. If so, we can attempt to track sightings. Additionally, I've learned that the Triarchs of Volantis have spent fortunes employing watchers and sorcerers to locate him. Maybe we can intercept some of their information." She raised her eyebrows. "You want to steal intelligence from the Triarchs? That's dangerous." His smile widened. "So is everything we're doing, but I have a few contacts in Volantis. With enough coin, we can learn at least where they suspect Drogon to be heading. Then we can try to get there first." She considered the risk. Volantis was a hornet's nest of ambition, especially now with dragons about. If they were caught stealing from the Triarchs, they'd be lucky to escape with their lives. But it might be the fastest way to find Drogon. "All right," she agreed. "Let's do it. But we must be cautious. And once we find Drogon, we must proceed carefully. The last thing we need is to provoke a citywide panic or an army of mercenaries while we attempt the rite." They rested another night at Chalias Point, then departed early the next morning, returning inland. Their journey to Volantis took weeks, winding through coastal roads and crossing territories where dragons had been sighted. They passed blackened fields, met refugees fleeing what they called the shadow of wings, encountered caravans ravaged by draconic attacks. Their hearts grew heavier with each story, each burned homestead. The woman's resolve hardened. They had to try something. Even if the right was a perilous gamble, the alternative was letting the chaos spread indefinitely. They reached the outskirts of Atlantis at dusk. The silhouette of the long bridge spanned the mouth of the Rhône River, leading into the ancient city with its towering walls and looming temples. Smoke from countless fires and forges hung in the air. Soldiers patrolled the gates, their armor polished, their eyes wary. The presence of dragons had evidently tightened security. The city thronged with travelers seeking refuge or profit. Eraz mentioned that the Triarchs had mobilized various sellsword companies to guard the city, but rumor claimed they were also planning an expedition to trap a dragon alive. A fool's errand, many said. Eraz and the woman entered the city under assumed names, claiming to be merchants seeking trade deals. They rented a small room in a dingy lodging house near the outer market. From there, Eraz left to make contact with one of his old associates, a spy who occasionally served the Triarchs but was known to double deal if the price was right. The woman, meanwhile, kept a low profile, wandering the market stalls to gauge the mood. Everywhere she heard anxious talk of dragons. Some stalls sold dragon charms, made of carved bone, promising protection against fire. Others displayed crossbow bolts said to be dragon-killing steel, though she doubted their authenticity. At nightfall, Eraz returned with news. "I found our man," he said, shutting their door quietly. "He confirms the Triarchs have gotten fresh reports of Drogon. A large black beast was sighted along the southern coast, near the Smoking Sea. He's believed to be roosting in the foothills of a volcanic range not far from the ruins of Gozai, an old Valyrian colony. The Triarchs plan to send a formidable force of mercenaries equipped with scorpions, net launchers, and rumored blood magic. They'll sail within a fortnight." "Nadmum." She felt a jolt of alarm. "Then we have to move quickly, or we risk crossing paths with them. If they reach Drogon first, a slaughter might ensue. Even if they fail, they could injure him severely, or provoke him into razing everything for miles." Eraz nodded. "Exactly. My contact also says the Triarch Belicho Kobar is leading the effort personally. He's rumored to have a new contraption called the Hellspitter, a device that hurls canisters of alchemical fire. They believe even dragon scales might not withstand it for long. So if we don't get there ahead of them," he let the thought hang. The woman paced, anxiety coursing through her. "We can't let them wound or kill Drogon. He's the key to this entire plan. If he dies, we lose the possibility of controlling the flight." Eraz exhaled. "We'll need a fast ship and a handful of discreet allies. My contact is willing to arrange passage on a swift caravel that can sail tomorrow. We'll beat the Triarchs to Gozai by several days if the winds favor us." She turned to him. "Will the Triarchs suspect we're after the same prize?" He shrugged. "Possibly. But we'll be out of the city by dawn, so it won't matter. If we succeed in the Ember Chain right, or at least forge some rapport with Drogon, we might avert the battle altogether. Or we might find ourselves caught between a furious dragon and an army bent on dragon killing." "Nemen Chao." Her stomach nodded. There was no turning back now. "Let's do it. We sail at dawn." They spent the night making final preparations, reviewing the incantation, mixing vials of potions that might help them survive dragonfire for a few seconds longer, though it was a crude remedy at best, sharpening a ceremonial dagger to draw blood. The woman's hand shook whenever she imagined facing Drogon. Could she truly bring herself to cut him for the sake of the right? The text was explicit. His blood had to be fresh. She wondered if there was a gentler way, but the instructions seemed absolute. They boarded the caravel at first light. It was manned by a small crew of mercenary-minded sailors who asked few questions after receiving their payment. The ship slipped away from Volantis under the shadow of dawn, sails catching a favorable breeze. Eraz and the woman stayed mostly below deck, poring over their notes. The crossing would take at least 5 days, skirting the southern coastline. The tension weighed heavier with each nautical mile they covered. On the third day at sea, a storm lashed the ship with howling winds. Lightning illuminated the horizon in stuttering flashes. The woman stood at the prow, letting rain pelt her face, thinking of dragons that might be soaring above the tempest. She felt a strange kinship with the elements now, as if she hovered on the cusp of an unimaginable destiny. Eraz joined her at the railing, steadying himself against the heaving deck. They exchanged no words, but their mutual resolve was clear in their eyes. At last, near dusk on the fifth day, the volcanic range that stood near Gozai came into view. The sky glowed a murky red in places, reflecting the molten activity that simmered beneath the mountains. The ruins of Gozai were said to lie inland, half sunk into the stony slopes. The captain anchored in a sheltered cove, refusing to go any closer to the black shores. Sulphurous fumes wafted across the water, and the sailors muttered about curses. The woman and Eraz disembarked with their gear, along with 2 hired guides who claimed to know a path through the rocky foothills. They traveled inland at a brisk pace, the sky darkening overhead. Stunted trees dotted the landscape, their branches twisted by volcanic ash and heat. Patches of the ground emitted wisps of steam. The air smelled of brimstone, reminiscent of Valyria. Every step heightened the woman's sense of déjà vu, another cursed land shaped by the doom of ages past. She recalled the scribbled note from the Triarch's spies. Drogon had been sighted roosting in these foothills, perhaps near an old fortress or a collapsed temple. By the second day of their inland journey, they encountered signs of a large dragon's presence. Scorched patches of ground, half-devoured carcasses of wild goats, footprints that dwarfed a man. The guides grew increasingly nervous, whispering of turning back. Eraz convinced them to stay, at least until they pinpointed Drogon's lair. They pressed on until midday. The land sloped upward, culminating in a jagged ridge of black stone. Beyond it lay a shallow valley dotted with vents that spewed hot gas. And there, perched on a rocky outcrop, was the silhouette of a colossal dragon. Even from a distance, the woman recognized the curve of those horns, the immense wings folded against its body, black scales shimmering with faint red highlights. Drogon. Her heart pounded so fiercely she thought she might faint. Eraz slowly lowered himself behind a boulder, motioning for the guides to do the same. "We found him," he whispered. "Now we need a plan." They observed for a time. Drogon lay motionless, as if basking in the volcanic heat that seeped from fissures in the ground. Occasionally, he shifted a wing or let out a slow exhale of smoke. He seemed at peace. The woman was reminded of how she had once seen him resting near Daenerys' side in a more innocent time, before King's Landing, before the final cataclysm. The memory clenched her chest with grief. "How do we approach without him roasting us on sight?" asked Eraz quietly. The woman adjusted her grip on the staff. "I might attempt a mental projection, a small incantation to announce our presence in a non-threatening way. Dragons don't speak words, but Drogon once recognized me. Perhaps there's a trace of that left." She glanced at the guides. "Best you stay here, or even retreat to a safer distance. If something goes wrong, you don't want to be caught in the fire." They needed little convincing. The guide scurried back down the slope. Eraz and the woman advanced slowly, picking their way over the rocky ridge, until they were perhaps 100 paces from Drogon. Her entire body trembled. She could almost feel the heat radiating from his scales. He was bigger than she remembered, or perhaps that was her fear magnifying him. Carefully she tapped her staff on the ground and murmured a quiet spell of empathy, a gentle push of calming energy that might at least prevent him from launching an immediate attack. Drogon stirred, lifting his massive head. Smoke curled from his nostrils. His eyes glowed like molten coals. Slowly, he swiveled his gaze toward them, pupils narrowing. The woman's heart thudded as she felt a wave of draconic presence wash over her, a primal sentience that recognized intruders. She took a steadying breath and stepped forward, raising her empty hand in what she hoped was a universal gesture of peace. "Drogon," she said softly, her voice trembling. She spoke his name in Valyrian as best she could, though it was nearly lost in the hot wind. Eraz stood at her side, equally tense. The black dragon let out a low rumble that vibrated the stones beneath their feet. He unfurled his wings slightly, as if preparing for flight or a fiery assault. The woman resisted the urge to flee. She forced herself to hold his gaze. Slowly, she let the empathy spell flow from her, a gentle wave of intangible energy that carried no compulsion, only reassurance. Dragons rarely responded to such attempts, but if Drogon was uniquely tied to the old magic, maybe he would sense her intentions. His rumble deepened. A flicker of flame danced in the back of his throat, but he did not lunge. She cautiously took another step. Eraz squeezed her arm, silently warning her not to push too far. She felt the heat intensify. The air stung her lungs with each breath, but Drogon did not incinerate them. Slowly, she lowered her staff, placing it on the ground, showing she held no weapon. Then she bowed her head, an acknowledgement of his power. Drogon's eyes narrowed. He snorted, a cloud of ash wafting from his nostrils. The woman dared to speak again, whispering a fragment of the incantation they had learned, substituting his name in place of the general references to the apex dragon. Her voice trembled, but she forced herself to continue. Eraz stood rigid, ready to bolt if the dragon unleashed a torrent of fire. The effect was subtle. Drogon cocked his head, as if perplexed by the alien syllables that rolled through the air. Then he let out a short, sharp roar that sent them stumbling back a step. Pebbles skittered across the ground. The woman's ears rang, but it was not a killing roar, more like a warning or a question. She steeled herself, continuing the incantation in a calm, measured tone. Suddenly, Drogon lashed out with his neck. The woman gasped, raising her arms in reflex, expecting to be crushed or bitten. But he only snapped his jaws a few feet away, a threat display. She felt hot wind wash over her face, singeing the edges of her hair. The stench of raw sulfur filled her nostrils. Eraz half drew the ceremonial dagger, but she grabbed his wrist, shaking her head. Not yet. If they drew blood now, Drogon might react violently. She resumed her chanting, letting the words flow around them, imagining a protective circle. A swirl of desert wind kicked up dust. Drogon growled, shifting his massive wings. Something passed between them, a faint, intangible link. For a moment, she felt a flicker of memory that was not her own. The taste of fresh meat, the heat of flight, the echo of Daenerys' laughter in a forgotten time. Then it was gone, replaced by a surge of draconic fury. The connection was tenuous, battered by Drogon's raw power. He roared again, unleashing a plume of fire into the sky. The woman shielded her face, heat blasting over them. Rocks melted in the inferno's path. Yet he did not aim directly at them. He was making a statement. You trespass on my domain. She sensed that if they did nothing, he might let them leave unscathed, but any further provocation might end in death. Eraz, eyes wide-mouthed. We need his blood. We have to do it now. She swallowed hard. The idea of hurting Drogon felt almost blasphemous. But the ritual demanded it, or so the glyphs stated. If they retreated now, the Triarch's force would arrive soon, and a bloodbath would ensue. She had to at least try. Taking a deep breath, she touched the potion at her belt, the one that might protect her from fire for a few seconds. She uncorked it and gulped it down, wincing at the bitter taste. Eraz did the same. Then, with trembling steps, she advanced. Drogon hissed, baring fangs. She raised her palms, chanting more firmly. The incantation called upon old Valyrian words that evoked an ancient pact between man and dragon. Her heart thundered so loudly, she feared it would burst. Another step, then another. Drogon lowered his head, eyes fixed on her. Smoke curled from his jaws. When she was within arm's reach of his shoulder, she could feel the furnace-like heat radiating through his scales. Summoning all her courage, she pressed her left palm against those scales and felt them burn her skin. Even through the protective potion, she let out a whimper of pain, but did not pull away. Drogon's eyes flicked to her hand. He let out a dangerously low growl. She murmured a soothing phrase in Valyrian, willing him to accept her presence. Eraz approached from the flank, the ceremonial dagger in hand. The plan was to cut a small line in Drogon's flank to draw blood. Even a drop would suffice if the rite was correct. But how to do so without triggering immediate slaughter? The woman tried to keep Drogon's attention on her, continuing the empathic incantation. She felt his enormous muscles ripple under her fingers, every breath vibrating through his body. Time seemed to slow as Eraz inched closer, dagger poised. The tension in the air was unbearable. Then the moment snapped. Drogon sensed the threat. With a sudden lurch, he swung his tail, striking Eraz across the chest. Eraz was flung backward, crashing into a rocky outcrop. He cried out, blood on his lips. The dagger skittered away. Drogon bellowed in fury, twisting his neck toward the woman. She yelped and scrambled backward. Flame roared from Drogon's mouth, engulfing her. She screamed, expecting oblivion, but the potion shielded her. Partially. She felt excruciating heat sear her clothing, singeing her hair, but it did not instantly kill her. Gasping, she shielded her face, tears mixing with sweat. In desperation, she unleashed a gust of wind with her staff, pushing the flames aside for a heartbeat. It was enough to let her stagger toward the fallen dagger. Her skin felt blistered, her eyes watery, but adrenaline propelled her. She scooped up the blade. Drogon lunged, jaws snapping. She rolled aside, hearing the crunch of stone as he bit into the ground. Eraz lay dazed, clutching his ribs. The woman rose, chanting the incantation at the top of her lungs. She locked eyes with Drogon, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I no enemy," she cried in high Valyrian, voice cracking. "I seek the chain of embers, the bond of old. Let me share our blood." The words tumbled out half-garbled, but she poured her will into them. Drogon roared, rearing up. A thunderous flap of his wings created a blast of wind that nearly knocked her flat. Yet, something in her plea seemed to stir him. He did not incinerate her on the spot. Instead, he hovered, panting, jaws dripping with liquid flame. The woman, trembling uncontrollably, took the dagger and slashed her own palm with a swift cut. Blood welled up, dripping onto the blackened stones. She held out her hand. "See? My blood." Drogon snorted, the air shimmering around his open maw. She advanced a single step, ignoring the pain. With her other hand she reached out, pressing the blade's tip lightly against a gap between two of Drogon's scales, just enough to prick the skin. She expected him to lash out and tear her apart. But perhaps curiosity, or the remnants of their old bond, stilled him for an instant. A single droplet of hot dragon's blood beaded at the tip of the dagger. She felt a surge of raw power emanate from that drop, as if it contained the molten heart of a volcano. The heat that pulsed from it made her arm quake. Carefully, she let it drip onto her wounded palm, mingling with her own blood. The moment the liquids touched, a shockwave of energy raced up her arm and through her entire body. Her vision blurred with red and gold spirals. She cried out, dropping the dagger. Drogon roared, craning his neck back. The ground shook beneath them. She fought to remember the final lines of the incantation. Through the haze of pain and power, she recited the words, letting the combined blood flow along her palm. She pressed her hand to Drogon's scale. The contact made her scream anew as a torrent of unimaginable force flooded her senses. For an instant, she saw into Drogon's mind. Swirling primal instincts, memories of Daenerys' touch, the fury of battle, the taste of ash in King's Landing, the heartbreak of her death, the lonely flights across empty skies. He glimpsed her memories too. A frightened girl fascinated by the old sorceries, the terror of facing stone-encased dragons in Valyria, the unwavering hope that a better world might be forged. The bond was agonizing, as if their essences clashed in an inferno. She could not tell where her body ended and Drogon's presence began. She felt as though she were dissolving into molten light. His roar merged with her scream in a single transcendent note. Then came a thunderous shockwave, toppling her to the ground. She lay sprawled on the hot stones, her body trembling. Her palms still bled, but the dragon's blood was visible too, mingled there. She felt something coursing in her veins, like liquid flame. Every nerve throbbed with raw energy. She managed to lift her head, expecting to see Drogon rearing back for a killing blow. Instead, he was staring at her, chest heaving, eyes wide with something akin to astonishment. Smoke wafted from his jaws, but he made no move to incinerate her. She felt an echo in her mind, a half-formed presence like a giant heart beating in sync with her own. Drogon. It was not a telepathic conversation in words, but she sensed confusion and a lingering hostility, tempered by grudging acceptance. She struggled to her feet, swaying. Eraz lay nearby, blood trickling from his forehead, but alive. Her vision flickered. She forced out the final phrase of the incantation, a shaky whisper in high Valyrian. Drogon let out a deep, resonant rumble that shook loose pebbles from the ridge. But it was no longer purely an expression of rage. Something had changed. An intangible tether bound them, however tenuously. She sensed it in her mind, an ability to feel Drogon's presence, to sense his mood, a swirl of images and impressions that made her dizzy. Gasping for breath, she lowered her hand. The wound burned with draconic heat, but the blood had begun to clot in an odd shimmering pattern. Drogon lowered his great head, snorting as if testing her scent. She froze, heart pounding. He nudged her gently with the tip of his snout, nearly knocking her over. She sensed wariness, resentment, and a flicker of recognition. Eraz groaned, pushing himself up. When he saw that Drogon had not killed her, his eyes widened in disbelief. Gods, it worked. She swallowed, tears filling her eyes. I don't know. I can feel him though, like a second heartbeat. Her voice shook with awe and terror. Eraz approached slowly, hand pressed to his ribs. Can you command him? She sensed Drogon's muscles tense at the word command. She felt a simmer of draconic pride, a rebellious snarl that rippled through her own mind. She shook her head. No, Tot. He's not some puppet. He's free. But maybe I can guide him, communicate with him. Nemdural. As if to test that theory, she attempted a small mental nudge, an appeal for calm. Drogon exhaled a plume of smoke, half opening his wings. The flicker of hostility lingered, but he did not lash out. She took that as a sign of progress. She stepped back, nearly stumbling. The ground was scattered with fresh scorch marks. Her clothing was singed. She felt battered and exhausted, but a wild hope coursed through her. If she could maintain this link, perhaps the ritual was a success. Eraz's gaze flicked to the sky. We don't have much time before the Triarch's force arrives, if our intel is correct. They'll be at sea or on the road, not far behind us. The woman nodded. Help me. We need to move to a safe place. Her gaze shifted to Drogon. She wondered if she could coax him to relocate. They didn't want a confrontation with an entire army of mercenaries. She probed the bond, sending an image of flight, of distant peaks away from prying men. Drogon let out a low snarl, as if resisting an imposition. She softened the intent, picturing a place of volcanic heat and safety, far from armies. She poured all her sincerity into it, promising no more pain. Gradually, Drogon stretched his wings, stirring up dust. He stared at her for a tense moment. Then, with a thunderous beat, he launched into the sky, sending gusts of wind that nearly knocked them off their feet. He circled once, roaring. She felt his challenge reverberate in her bones, but he did not vanish over the horizon. Instead, he landed on a higher ridge and stared down at them, waiting. She realized he wanted them to follow. Eraz groaned, pressing a hand to his bruised side. How exactly are we supposed to keep up with him? She managed a shaky laugh. We'll do our best. If we can stay close enough, maybe I can keep him from straying into the path of the Triarchs. Her voice wavered. This is only the beginning. They gathered their scattered gear, retrieved the guides, and began the arduous climb. Overhead, Drogon soared from ridge to ridge, sometimes vanishing behind columns of steam. The bond thrummed in the woman's mind, fragile, yet potent. She sensed his wariness, his fierce independence, but also a faint acceptance that had not been there before. They climbed until dusk, chasing that black silhouette across treacherous ground. At times she felt on the verge of collapse, the scalding heat from her wound sapping her strength. But determination drove her onward. By nightfall they found a sheltered alcove amid the rocks. Drogon perched on an outcrop above them, tail swishing idly. The woman and Iraz kindled a small fire, ignoring the irony of needing mundane flames in the shadow of a creature that could unleash an inferno. The guides, terrified of Drogon's presence, kept their distance. No one slept well. The woman spent hours drifting in a haze, bombarded by half-formed visions of flying, hunting, a silver-haired queen smiling in a sunlit courtyard. She woke with a start, more than once, disoriented. Sometimes she sensed Drogon's emotions flaring, anxious or resentful. Perhaps he was testing the boundaries of this new link. She tried to project calm, to reassure him she was no threat. The night passed in fits and starts. At dawn, they heard distant horns echoing across the rocky plains. That sound set everyone's nerves on edge. The Triarch's forces were near, or perhaps a scouting party. The woman quickly conferred with Iraz. They agreed they should lead Drogon away before the confrontation could happen. She looked up at the great black beast, perched ominously overhead. She concentrated, forming an image of traveling further inland, away from the coast. She infused the thought with urgency, letting him sense the threat. Drogon hissed, turning his head toward the faint echoes of horns. She saw his pupils dilate. She sensed flickers of memory, images of men with weapons, the stench of blood. She tried to show him that these new men coming were far more numerous and better armed than the ones he'd easily slain before. He let out a roar that rattled the rocks. She gasped, pressing a hand to her chest. She could feel his anger, the surging desire to burn any who challenged him. But she projected caution, sending a sense of danger, of cunning enemies. For a tense moment, Drogon seemed torn. He opened his jaws, exhaling a swirl of smoke. Then, with a titanic leap, he took flight, heading inland. The woman closed her eyes in relief, leaning on her staff for support. They had convinced him to avoid a direct battle, at least for now. Her bond with him was new and fragile, but it might spare countless lives this day. Iraz and the woman hastily gathered their few supplies. The guides refused to continue further, wanting no part in this madness. They demanded payment and turned back toward the sea. The woman did not try to dissuade them. So, it would be only her and Iraz. They exchanged a grim look and followed Drogon's path across the rugged terrain, hoping they could stay close enough that he did not vanish altogether. They walked for hours, guided only by glimpses of Drogon's dark shape overhead. Sometimes he would land, waiting on a high ridge, as if curious to see if they could keep pace. The bond thrummed with tangled sensations: hunger, restlessness, the desire for flight. She wondered how long she could maintain this precarious connection. Each step was agony on her burned skin, and the wound in her palm still radiated a feverish heat. But she pressed on. By midday, they arrived at a barren plateau littered with steaming vents. Drogon was perched at the far edge, scanning the horizon. From that vantage, they could see an expanse of bleak land stretching in all directions. No sign of armies, no sign of refuge. The sky was pale and cloudless. The woman approached Drogon carefully, Iraz by her side. The ground felt unstable, heat pulsating just beneath the surface. She reached out through the bond, trying to sense Drogon's mood. He was uneasy, picking up on her wariness. She wished she could rest for a day, but fear of the Triarch's approach gnawed at her. She recalled the battered fortress in Valyria's outskirts, where she had first glimpsed him awakening ancient dragons. She remembered the small measure of reverence they showed him. Perhaps if they could find a remote place to establish a safe roost, they could begin to shape some new equilibrium between men and dragons. But would the rest of the flight heed Drogon's new partial bond with a human? Question loomed, and the answer was far from certain. She only knew that, for now, she stood at the threshold of a new age. The black dread hovered between feral independence and a fragile alliance with one mortal woman who dared to share his blood. She lifted her eyes to his, and in that molten gaze, she thought she saw a spark of Daenerys' memory, of a future not yet written, of an ancient empire's lost glory tempered by new possibility. They lingered on that plateau, uncertain of the next step, forging a strange, perilous partnership. In the distance, horns might sound again, or a new flight of dragons might appear, or some city might fall to flames. But in that moment, the woman and Drogon simply stood together under a harsh sun. Two survivors of the old world, bound by blood and a tenuous hope that, somehow, they could forge a path that might spare Essos the worst of the conflagration to come. She took a trembling breath, raised her staff, and began to walk closer. Drogon waited, tail lashing slowly, smoke curling from his maw. Eraz hung back, watching with awe and trepidation. The woman stepped forward, step by painful step, and laid her scorched hand once more against Drogon's scales. This time, his roar was not a warning, but a low rumble that vibrated through her bones, an acknowledgement of the bond that now existed between them. In that shared breath of heat and dust, she felt the edges of a grand, perilous destiny. The doom of Valyria might echo across time, but so too might its redemption. And as the Black Dread lowered his head, letting her lean upon him for one fleeting moment, she dared to believe that a new story, one of blood, fire, and perhaps a measure of mercy, had begun. Only time would tell whether the heart of a dragon and the will of a mere mortal could reshape the fate of nations, or if all would be swallowed once more by the unrelenting fury of a power too great to be bound. Yet in that single heartbeat, a slender thread of hope shimmered like a scale catching the sun, luminous and alive, waiting for the next stroke of fate to decide its final shape.